Now, the iPhone and the iPad are changing the game for the technology industry around the world, and Apple's monster success is boosting its suppliers as well. Since Apple's latest earnings report, Foxconn is trading at its highest point in more than 2 months. But with great success also comes great scrutiny. No manufacturing process is scrutinized more than Apple's. Just 2 weeks ago, Apple released an unprecedented report detailing the good, the bad, and the ugliest working conditions at its suppliers' factories in China. Apple also became the first technology company to join the Fair Labor Act, saying it's doing more audits than ever before and finding fewer violations. Still, some question whether the conditions are really acceptable. For more on who Apple's suppliers are, let's first turn to our senior West Coast correspondent, Jon Erlichman, back in the newsroom. Jon.
Emily, we know that Apple has hundreds of suppliers, but there are a few that handle the lion's share of the work. And that means huge dollars, considering that in the last quarter alone, Apple spent something like $25 billion making all those products, the iPhones and the iPads, and shipping them around the world. If you look at the most recent available data on the cost of goods sold at Apple, which tells you what they're spending on their products, Foxconn, which you just mentioned, is at the top of the list, dominant by far when it comes to being Apple's supplier. What's interesting is the number 2 player is Samsung. We speak so much about the battle between these two companies, and yet Apple relies so heavily on Samsung. And Quantum Computer is a third that is a very substantial supplier to the company. Obviously, we've talked about how the Macs are selling well. That is a key part of what Quanta does for the company. And yet, there are so many suppliers. We just said there are hundreds. I mean, Intel, Broadcom, SanDisk, NVIDIA, the list goes on of all the big names that get a piece of business from Apple all the time. Emily?
Now, Jon, how does Apple's supplier list compare to other big names in technology, many of which you just mentioned?
I mean, if the question is, does Foxconn play the role of key supplier to a bunch of other technology companies, the answer is easily yes. I mean, at HTC or Nokia or at Motorola Mobility, which of course is now owned by Google, Foxconn is the key supplier. It is also the key supplier for Cisco. And if you look at other big technology companies like IBM, like Intel, like Lenovo, like HP, in all these cases, it's not the largest supplier, but it is a key supplier, and it's one of the reasons why we're speaking so much about the Foxconn story. Emily?
All right, thanks for that, Jon Erlichman. Now, for a closer look at Apple's supply chain, I'm joined from New York by 2 analysts who have both been inside Apple's suppliers' factories and visit China and Taiwan regularly. Brian Blair, an analyst at Wedge Partners, who also covers HTC and Motorola, and Brian White, managing director of equity research at Ticonderoga Securities, who also covers companies like HP and Dell that make electronics abroad. Gentlemen, welcome to Bloomberg West. Thanks so much for joining us. Obviously, this is a topic we're hearing more and more about. Apple released that report a couple of weeks ago, information it's never shared before. Brian White, let's start with you. What new information did you learn from that, particularly about some of these labor issues?
Well, I think what a lot of investors and people that visit the website learned is that Apple is becoming much more transparent about their supply chain. And I think if you look at some of the practices on worker treatment, they're actually treating their workers in those plants a lot better than many of the technology OEMs in the world. So I think transparency and fair treatment of labor is a big topic. And I think one of the reasons this has become such an issue is because Apple is so big, so popular, and such a news item. But I've gone over to China 50 times, and I will tell you, I think the Apple supply chain and the treatment of their workers is better than most tech OEMs in the world.
Now, we did reach out to Apple for comment. They did not comment, but we do have that detailed report to rely on. Brian Blair, give us an idea how much faster and how much cheaper Apple's products are because they do it this way with all of these jobs offshore.
Look, it's critical. If you go into Foxconn, this is a walled city essentially that houses hundreds of thousands of workers in one place. They sleep there, they eat there, their dorms are there, and they can wake up and and walk 100 yards to their job. And so I think that because of that, we can't replicate that in the United States to the extent they can there. And so I think it's critical. It's been critical to Apple, being able to scale to, tens of thousands to tens of millions of units within a quarter. And it's critical to the speed of not only manufacturing these devices and getting them to market in a short period of time, but also really scaling up. I mean, it's a pretty incredible thing that Apple went from 17 million units in the September quarter to 37 million units in the December quarter. And it's the size and the scale of Foxconn on the manufacturing side that allows them to do this.
Now, Brian White, how extreme would you say the conditions are? Are the conditions unfair?
Okay. Again, I've been to China 50 times, and I go 5 to 6 times a year, and I've been through these factories many, many times. And I will tell you what I've seen over the past decade is the working environment has gotten much, much better at all of these factories. China mandates a 15-20% increase in minimum wage increase every year. Many of the employees eat there, they work there. They have entertainment, they go on trips, they play volleyball. I really think the working conditions and the issues in the media have really gotten out of control. I've been there, and I have seen the improvement over the past decade, and it's meaningful.
So Brian, what you also cover HP and Dell, how do the conditions there compare to conditions in factories that HP and Dell are using?
I would say this, most of these companies are using similar suppliers, okay? What I have learned is that Apple provides a better margin to their suppliers than Dell and HP. Apple doesn't go out there and just look for the lowest cost. They have the scale that helps them. What they're looking for is the highest quality, the highest reliability, and they're giving a better margin than their suppliers for that.
Brian Blair, would you agree, or do some suppliers, simply because of the boost that comes from working for Apple, simply want to work harder for Apple?
No, I think that Apple has raised the bar for manufacturing across the board in China, but not just in China. I think they're raising the bar with other partners in places like Malaysia and Singapore. And I agree with Brian White. Apple has helped, I think, improve the overall worker conditions over the last few years. It's just that it's really only been, I think, in the last 2 years or so that you're hearing about it more. A number of years ago, there were a number of suicides at Foxconn, and I think that led to people really looking at the kind of the global media, taking a close look at the working conditions there. So it's become a popular topic. But I think there's been a lot of positive things going on for the last couple of years, and I agree with Brian's observations about the working conditions being better than they were, and Foxconn in particular being heads and tails above a lot of the other manufacturers. And part of that is because Apple holds these guys' feet to the fire. If they don't meet certain standards, they have risk of losing Apple as a customer, and we all know nobody wants that.
We know Apple has this supplier code of conduct. Brian White, what sort of punishment or what are these suppliers facing if they don't live up to this code of conduct or make these violations?
Well, I think ultimately you're not going to be working with Apple if there's too many violations. So they're one of the few companies out there that has actually put this policy in place. You mentioned the Fair Labor Association. They're the first technology company to be a part of that.
That's right.
So not only is Apple, raising the bar in terms of how you treat these employees, they also provide compensation to help them learn English, to learn computer skills, to use the internet. I've been through these operations, and it's not a bad working condition at all. It's a very good working condition.
All right. Gentlemen, hang on. Brian White and Brian Blair, analysts in New York. We're going to continue this conversation after the break, looking into Apple's supply chain and whether offshore jobs could ever come back to the United States. Welcome back. I'm Emily Chang. Continuing our conversation about Apple's supply chain, I want to bring back Brian White of Ticonderoga Securities and Brian Blair of Wedge Partners, both joining us from New York. Gentlemen, both of you have been talking about how Apple has really raised the bar in manufacturing. But what's the bottom line? Brian Blair, let's start with you. What is more important to Apple, the quality of products or the quality of life of its workers?
Gosh, you know what? I'd like to think that it's the quality of the life of the workers, but at the end of the day, they care about the products. But I think what's important is that they're finding a balance. You know, they're more than anybody else, I think, in consumer electronics, they care about what the quality of their products in every facet. But what I think this supplier responsibility report has shown, and these efforts that we're seeing in the press, are showing that they want to raise the quality for the workers. You know, it's important for them to have both.
Brian White, your take?
No, I agree. I think what Apple is looking for is companies that can balance both. They can produce the high quality product and also provide a high quality work environment. If you can't do both, you're not good enough for Apple. And I think that's who they're looking for.
That's right.
Now, Brian Blair, is there anything that could ever change that would lead Apple to bring some of these jobs back to the United States?
No. On the manufacturing side, I think it's a simple no. You know, there might be some things down the line, maybe a chip here, a chip there, that are actually made in the United States at some fab here in the U.S. But I think, you know, Steve Jobs actually said this. I understand that when he met with Obama last year with a number of other, you know, tech luminaries in the Valley, and this apparently came up. And the story is that Steve Jobs said these jobs are never coming back to the U.S. And one of the reasons for that is because we're never going to see a manufacturing facility at the scale of Foxconn anywhere in the U.S. because Americans are not willing to go and live in the hundreds of thousands or the tens of thousands inside of the facility like they are in China. And I think that, you know, that's a simple reason why they're not coming back here. Now, look, there might be some manufacturing that comes back, maybe a product here or there, but on the whole, I don't think we're ever going to see facilities like we see in China in the United States in our lifetimes.
Brian White, do we just have to accept that these jobs are gone for good?
Yes, I think these jobs are gone for good. And, you know, I've just got a message for President Obama. If you look at the American people, they do not want their children manufacturing iPhones. They want their children being able to afford to buy iPhones. And the labor rates in China are $1.50 to $2 fully burdened with your dorm versus about $20 in the U.S. And it's not just that. The supply base is so built out there. All the suppliers are there around the corner. You save logistics costs. Is never coming back. We don't want it to come back. Keep it in China. We need to focus on higher value jobs in the United States, and that's the solution.
Now, Brian White, you know, you also work with HP and Dell. Do you see some of these other technology companies becoming more transparent as Apple has, having released this report? Do you see them under pressure to do similar things to make sure that standards are the same across the factories of their suppliers?
Yes, I do. I mean, Apple sets a high bar in a lot of areas. Ethics, quality, reliability, aesthetics. I think you'll see other companies start to follow Apple's more transparent supply chain path.
Now, Brian Blair, you know, this was a very unusual move for Apple. Under Tim Cook, do you see Apple's sort of legendary security policy changing? Is Apple going to be more open from now on, or is this just unusual?
I don't think they're ever going to be any more open about upcoming products, you know, and Tim Cook's comments on the conference call, you know, point to that. They're never going to be more open in that regard because it's very important to their product strategy. But I think this definitely does herald, you know, a new era of being open about their suppliers because it's the way to show that they are, you know, trying to make a difference in the manufacturing side and on the environmental side and on the side of workers' rights and wages and all these various issues that are important. But I think that there's a big difference between letting the public know who you're working with on, you know, for semiconductors and letting people know what's actually coming down the line. I don't think there will ever be any openness from Apple on that side. It's the secret to their success.
All right, Brian Blair of Wedge Partners, Brian White of Ticonderoga Securities. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts today. I think this was a really illuminating conversation.